Hey everyone, welcome to the week of September 21st through the 25th. We are going to be continuing with the skill we started working on last week, which was Inference, and we're going to be continuing working with social studies. So for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be doing a little social studies lessons on voting, why voting matters, and what you can do to make sure that you are registered to vote. So the first thing I want to tell you is that on Google Classroom, underneath the classwork section at the very top, there's a section that says how to vote. So today, Tuesday, is National Voter Registration Day. So in that post, what you can do, you can check to see if you're registered, you can learn how to register to vote, and you can learn about the different ways that you can vote in Kentucky, because there are now 3 ways that we can be voting. We can vote in person on election day, we can vote in person but early, and we can do absentee ballots or mail-in ballots, which means that you get to do your voting at home and then mail in or drop off your ballot. So go check out that post for a little bit more information. So today what we're going to do, we're going to be talking about how we got the right to vote and different ways that the right to vote has been challenged or misused in the past. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my video, and we are going to talk about voting. Okay, so we're going to be talking about voting rights and how you got the right to vote, because different groups of people got the right to vote at different times in American history. So we're going to be talking about those, and we're going to be practicing our skill of inference when we talk about choosing whether or not someone got to vote with a specific example. So what I'm going to encourage you to do, make sure you have a pencil and paper with you, because you are going to need that as we continue. Alrighty. So first thing we're going to talk about is the early years of American history. We want to remember that America as a country was founded when colonists came over from England. And when they came over from England, they brought a lot of the laws and customs that England had. That means that a lot of the laws that we have in terms of who can vote and why they can vote came from English society. We also want to remember that in most of the 13 colonies, and this is really, really early, so this is before the American Revolution, most of the 13 colonies, only adult white males that own land, and it usually had to be at least 50 acres, could vote. So I want to pause for a minute, and I want to talk about what inference we can make from this. If only adult white males owned land, we want to be thinking of who does that exclude? The reason that land ownership was so important is because a lot of people believe that landowners were the only people responsible enough to make political decisions. That means that anyone who didn't qualify was not really capable in their eyes of making decisions. So that means if we make that inference, who are the people that could be excluded? So if we think about the people that we know, I know that the first person that I think of is that I wouldn't be allowed to vote because I'm a woman. So that automatically excludes me. So what other inferences can you make about who would be excluded? I want you to think for a minute before you continue on. So pause the video and think who else might be excluded in these early years of the colonies. So now that you've made your guess, let's take a look. If we are talking about who would be excluded, it would leave out poor white men because they would have no land. It left out women because they were not male. It left out American Indians because they also did not have the same ownership of land that colonists considered to be appropriate. And it also left off Africans, both free and enslaved, because they were not white men. So it left out huge portions of the population of the voting process. What I'm taking from that, the inference that I make, is that the rules that were being created were only rules that applied to, they were only rules that were created by a select few but applied to everyone. Not everyone's voice was being heard. So let's move on a little bit and talk about when we got our independence. So we're going to move to the 1790s when we are talking about the American Revolution and when the Constitution was created. And this leads us to who gets the vote after our independence. The framers of the Constitution just could not agree on who should have the right to vote. A framer is one of the group of people who created or wrote the Constitution. So we want to think about people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Madison. All of these people were involved in our constitutional framing. Since they couldn't come to an agreement about who should have the right to vote, they decided to give each state the power to decide who could vote. America, we know, is represented in both its federal government and its state government. This is one of the ways that the state government has a say in their own individual rights. So if we take a look at this picture over here, I want you to take a second and see if you recognize any people. Think about people that you may have seen on money. So when I look at this picture, we see some pretty famous people, people like Benjamin Franklin, we see people like Benjamin Franklin, we see Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and John Adams. 3 of those 4 men went on to become presidents of the United States. So over time, as America continued to grow and change, states dropped their requirements that voters had to own property, which now meant that more people could vote. Now, sometimes it took a little bit longer than in others. So New York, for instance, was one of the earlier adopters, and they got rid of property requirements in 1821, versus a state like Rhode Island, which didn't change until 1880, which is a very long time to still have property requirements for voting. So we're going to move on and talk about some of the different groups that gained the right to vote and when they gained the right to vote. So the first group of people that we are going to look at are the African American vote. So the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, which was 5 years after the end of the Civil War. We know that the Civil War was fought because of slavery, because some states did not want to do away with slavery and some states didn't feel that that was correct. So we fought the Civil War, and the North won, which led to the passing of the 15th Amendment. And that amendment states that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So what does this actually mean? If we break it down, the 15th Amendment says that former slaves could not be turned away because of the color of their skin or the fact that they had been slaves. We know because of earlier voting conditions that if you were not a white man, you were not allowed to vote. The 15th Amendment does away with that and says that it does not matter about the color of the skin or the fact that you had been a slave. You can still vote. Now, we are going to see in a little while that this doesn't mean that everyone got the right to vote immediately. We're going to talk about some of the challenges that came along with this in just a few minutes. But first, what we want to do is we want to talk about this gentleman here. We're going to make an inference. Based off of what we have learned so far, we want to decide, can he vote? So here's the information I know. The year is 1915. He is a single African-American man living in Chicago, Illinois. So we want to say, can this man vote? Pause the video, and I want you to make an inference. Can he vote? All right. My inference is that yes, he can vote. It is 1915. It is well after the 15th Amendment came about, so he has the right to vote. The second group of people that we're going to talk about are the women's right to vote. So women worked really hard to earn the right to vote. In Wyoming was actually the first state to give women the right to vote in 1869, but it took so much longer for women to actually earn the right to vote. And it was because of women like you see here, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and a lot of others who worked really hard to earn the right to vote for women. And when we talk about women's right to vote, this movement would not have succeeded without the African American leaders that really pushed to have women to help them gain the right to vote. So women won the right to vote in August of 1920, so it has been just over 100 years since women earned the right to vote. So it's not been that long. The 19th Amendment, much like the 15th Amendment, says that the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied on account of sex, meaning that men and women can both vote and that there is no restriction. So let's make another inference. Here we have a woman living in New York City in the year 1924. She is 25, married, and has 2 children. Can she vote? Let's make that inference. I want you to pause the video and decide if she can or cannot vote. All right, my inference is that yes, she can vote. The amendment passed in 1920. This is 4 years after the fact, saying that women could vote. So yes, she can vote. The third group of people that we want to talk about are the American Indians. So American Indians were not considered citizens of the United States until 1924. Before that time, they were each considered members of their own tribal governments, which means that they did not participate in the United States government as a whole. They were each represented by their individual tribe. But in 1924, Calvin Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act, which stated that American Indians had the rights and privileges of American citizenship, meaning that they could do anything that an American citizen could do, including vote. But the big but here is that it took nearly 40 years for all 50 states to guarantee them the right to vote. So that puts it into the 70s, if we think about it that way. 40 years. That's a very, very long time. Despite the 15th Amendment, states were still denying the rights of American Indians to vote. Because when we think about the 15th Amendment, we said it allowed anyone of race, creed, or color to vote. That applied to American Indians as well. So let's make another inference. This man is an American Indian living in Montana in 1910. He is 65 years old, married, has 3 kids and 7 grandchildren. So can he vote? Let's make an inference using everything we know. Pause the video and make a decision. All right, so my inference is that no, he can't vote yet because Calvin Coolidge didn't sign that document until a lot later, after 1910. This man cannot vote yet. The last group of people that we want to talk about are the folks that lived in Washington, D.C. So Washington, D.C. is known as the District of Columbia. It is not a state, so it was not guaranteed the same rights to vote as a state was. So they did not participate or gain the right to vote in a presidential election until the 23rd Amendment was ratified in 1961. So this was not that long ago. So we'll make another inference based off of that information. This woman lives in Washington, D.C., just down the street from the White House. The year is 1955. She is a 35-year-old woman with 2 children. So given everything we know, pause the video and make an inference. Can this woman vote? So given what I know, no, she cannot vote yet because it is 1955 and that amendment hadn't been ratified yet. All right. So one of the things that we really want to focus on when we talk about gaining the right to vote, we want to talk about the Civil Rights Amendment. Voting is a civil right. It is something that you are entitled to do as a citizen of the United States. But after the Civil War, people in the South just did not want African Americans to have the same rights as white Americans. And this includes voting and holding office. So after the Civil War, we are ushered into a movement called the Jim Crow era, which sees segregation, discrimination, and abuse for people that are not white. So African Americans are facing a lot of abuse, and voting is just one of the ways that this abuse was carried out. So there are a lot of things that happened that made voting impossible, and a lot of things that we now fight against to make sure that everyone is allowed to the right to vote. So there were barriers set up to the African American vote during the Jim Crow era, and this is something that states and individual counties used. They use different methods to prevent African Americans from voting, and some of these methods include things like limiting the opportunities to register to vote. So it's saying silly things like you can only register to vote on Fridays from 5 to 6 a.m. and that is it. Everyone has to register at that time. That means that not everyone is going to have the opportunity to register. In the South, arrests and beatings by the police really were a huge barrier to the African American vote to prevent someone from voting. Another barrier is the threat of violence towards the voter's family and their home. So it is not just physical violence towards that person, but it is physical violence towards their family, their loved ones, and their home. We also have things like personal information shared with groups like the KKK and your employers. Those are not groups that you necessarily want having access to all of your personal information. And last thing that is a barrier are the unfair tests that are presented at polls. These are poll tests. These are things that don't exist anymore, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them. So poll tests, were terrible testing systems that asked you to provide an answer to a test that was nearly impossible to prove that you were a fit voter. These were things like asking you to correctly identify the number of cotton balls in the jar that you see to the left before they're allowed to vote, or things like asking you to guess the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. These are next to impossible tasks, but this is what was asked of the African American community to be able to vote. So this is a huge barrier. Another barrier that was presented were literacy tests. They were a type of poll test that were given in some locations where voters were tested on their literacy skills. Now the problem with this is that usually passed, and African American voters usually failed, and a lot of this was to do with the level of education that was provided. In the South, if you were African American, good education was usually out of your reach. It just meant that you didn't have that ability to be as educated because of things like segregation and discrimination. So these are a couple of examples of voting requirements that happened in the South for Alabama and Louisiana. In Alabama, your requirements to vote were to read a section of the Constitution out loud, which practiced your reading skills, to tell what the section said in your own words, which is summarizing, to write out another complete section of the Constitution, and to answer 8 questions about the Constitution. Now, this seems to be something that we could make an argument make sense, but honestly, this is horrible because when we think about it, a lot of people, 95% of the population, wouldn't be able to write out a complete section of the Constitution or answer questions about it. So it's unfair to ask one group of people and not everyone to answer those questions. In Louisiana, we see things like voters who couldn't prove a 5th grade education had to do the following things. You had to complete a 30-question test, and you had to finish that test in 10 minutes. Now, I don't know about you, but I have never done a test that I could answer 30 questions in 10 minutes. That is a crazy amount of time. And some of the other problems that we see are the way that these tests are put out. So tests like these were really horrible because African Americans, like I said earlier, just lacked access to a quality education, and that meant these tests excluded African Americans from voting. So these are a couple of examples that are literacy tests. The top one we see is a literacy test from Alabama, and the bottom one is a literacy test from Louisiana. So I want to look at the literacy test from Louisiana here. Spell backwards forwards. I don't even know what that's trying to ask me. Am I spelling backwards to the front? Am I spelling forwards backwards? I would have no idea what to answer for these, and I think many of us wouldn't have the answer for that as well. So if we want to think about answering these questions in 10 minutes, it's crazy. No one can do it, and it's just a way to eliminate people from voting, to exclude you from your rights. Another way that African Americans were excluded from voting after the Civil War was through the grandfather clause. So this might be something that you've heard of in other instances as well. A grandfather clause just means that if someone related to you had an ability to do something, that you have that too. when we talk about specifically the right to vote, the grandfather clause states that you only have the right to vote if your grandfather had the right to vote, which is next to impossible when we think about African Americans who did not have their freedom until after the Civil War. It was impossible for them to vote. So it made it very unlikely that your grandfather had the right to vote, which means that you also would not have the right to vote. Another way that we talk about excluding people from voting is through the poll tax. So poll tax required voters to pay for the ability to vote. And this is something that we actually see now, currently. There are debates about whether or not different programs actually constitute as poll taxes, like having to pay off fines to the city before you're allowed to vote. A poll tax just means that you have to pay a certain amount of money to be able to vote. So most Southern African Americans were poor sharecroppers, which means that they were farmers that were putting a lot of their money towards the land, and they were in debt to the people who actually owned the land. So it meant that they couldn't pay the poll tax. So, for example, here, $1.50 poll tax in 1932 is really a $23 poll tax today, which is just crazy. That's a large amount of money to pay to vote. So I really like this political cartoon over here, because what this is showing is that poll taxes just didn't affect African Americans, although that was the majority. It affected anyone who was poor. If you couldn't afford to vote, your voice wasn't heard. So this is another way that we are seeing that African Americans are excluded from the right to vote. So let's do another inference. Based off of everything we've talked about, here's my example. This man is a 20-year-old African American living in the Deep South in 1948. He works in cotton fields and cannot read or write. So, can he vote? Based off of everything that we've talked about, I want you to go ahead and make that inference. Can he vote? Pause the video. All right, so my inference is that he probably would not vote. Yes, he has the right to vote, but that does not necessarily mean that he would get to vote. So we want to think about all of the things that kept African Americans from voting in the past, meant that this man probably would not have the right to vote. But a lot of that has changed recently when we talk about the civil rights movement. So more and more people started to demand rights for all Americans, including African Americans. And that was really the push to end a lot of these horrible suppressive voting tactics. So when we talk about the civil rights movement, the main person we think about are people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., who led marches, speeches, sit-ins, freedom rides, activism, activities that all combined into what we now think of as the civil rights movement. One of the largest results of the civil rights movement was the ending of segregation and the 24th Amendment, which was added to the Constitution in 1964. So the 24th Amendment banned all use of poll taxes in elections, which meant that you now didn't have to pay to vote. So when we look at the picture here, there are two really important people that hopefully we can identify at least one, if not both of them. We have Lyndon B. Johnson, who was the president in 1964 and signed that 24th Amendment, and we also have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So with these voting laws that changed, we also have the Voting Rights Act, which was signed by Johnson in 1965. So this law is where we see a lot of the change that has happened. This law said that it protected the right to vote for all citizens, which meant that you could not do anything to infringe the right to vote of an American citizen. It forced states to obey the Constitution to the letter, which meant that things like poll taxes, literacy tests, things, and the grandfather clause were not allowed to happen because they are not in the Constitution. It also really reinforced the 15th Amendment that regardless of your race, color, or ethnicity, you could vote. So one of the strongest tools that we have today to allow all voters to vote is the Voting Rights Act, and it benefits everyone, specifically African Americans. So another voting change that happened, and this is one of the last voting changes that has happened in the United States, happened in the 60s and 70s. So this is when America is at war in Vietnam, and many of the kids that were going over to fight in Vietnam were too young to vote. Voting was limited to 21 and older, and yet you had kids who were 18 going over to war. So the 26th Amendment was passed in 1971, and the 26th Amendment says that the right of citizens in the United States who are 18 years or older shall not be denied on account of age. So basically what this was saying was that if kids were old enough to fight, they were old enough to vote, which is something that we see now continually. You have to be 18 to be able to vote. So we're going to make another inference. Based off of what we've just heard, let's talk about this person here. He just graduated from high school in Maryland. He is 18 years old. It is 1972, and he just got drafted to fight in the war in Vietnam. So, can this young gentleman vote? I want you to pause the video and make your inference. All right, so my inference is that yes, he can. He is 18. It is 1972, so this is after the amendment passed that regulated the age to vote. All right, so after my little animation loads here, got all those people waiting to line up, we're going to do a little bit of review. So if you have not been taking notes this way through, I really recommend jotting down the answers and the questions in our review here, just so that we have a chance to remember the most important information. All right, so my first question, do you have to own land to vote in the United States? And this is currently, so do you have to currently own land to vote in the United States? Yes or no? Pause the video and make your selection. All right, so the answer, do you have to own land to vote in the United States? No, we do not. All land ownership requirements were ended by 1880, which means that since I rent, I don't own my house or the land, I can still vote. All right, here's our second question. Rhode Island was the first state to give women the right to vote. True or false? Pause your video and think of your answer. All right, this answer is false. Rhode Island was not the first state to give women the right to vote. That was Wyoming in 1869, which was well ahead of the rest of the country. All right, question number 3. Forcing people to pay for the right to vote is called a blank. Is that called a literacy test or a poll tax? Pause the video and make your decision. All right, forcing people to pay for the right to vote is called a poll tax. Poll taxes were used to keep poor African Americans from voting. Literacy tests were also used to keep poor African Americans from voting, but it was not the same type of test. Okay, are Native Americans U.S. citizens? Yes or no? Pause the video and make your answer. My answer is yes. Because of the Indian Citizenship Act passed in 1924 by Calvin Coolidge, we know that Native Americans are U.S. citizens in addition to being members of their tribes. All right, my next question. The Voting Rights Act reinforced the 15th Amendment. Was this true or false? Pause the video and decide on your answer. All right, my answer is true. The Voting Rights Act really reinforced the 15th Amendment. So we know that the 15th Amendment said that anyone could vote regardless of race, but there were many ways of preventing African Americans from voting. Things like poll taxes, literacy taxes, the grandfather clause. All of these things prevented African Americans from voting. And the Voting Rights Act was written to remove these barriers. Okay. Which war led to the passage of the 26th Amendment, World War II, or the Vietnam War? Pause your video and decide on your answer. So my answer is the Vietnam War. Many of the soldiers that were fighting in the Vietnam War were too young to vote, and the 26th Amendment is what took the voting age from 21 down to 18, which meant that if you were fighting in the war, you were old enough to vote as well. All right. Are the residents of Washington, D.C. banned from voting for the president? Yes or no? We're going to pause the video and make your decision. So my answer is that no, they are not banned from voting for president. It was because of the 23rd Amendment that was passed in 1961. Now, if you live in Washington, D.C., you can also vote. Okay. Susan B. Anthony worked to give Native Americans the right to vote. Is this true or false? Pause your video and make your decision. This is false. Susan B. Anthony worked really hard for the rights of women to vote, not for Native Americans. Okay. Our earliest ideas about voting came from which country? Did they come from France or from England? Pause your video and make your selection. My answer is that our earliest ideas about voting came from England. Remember that America, before it was America, was colonies of England, and when colonists came over from England, they brought those ideas and customs along with them. So we have kind of gone through this brief history of the voting rights in America and the history that led us to where we are today. Now, everything that we have talked about has made progress in everything we've talked about has made progress in American history to allow all American citizens to vote. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not still struggles and that there are not still battles we have to fight. So next week, what we're going to be talking about is gerrymandering, which is a technique that different groups of politicians use to kind of pick and choose the people that vote for them. So keep that in mind. And remember, again, it is National Voter Registration Day, so make sure you go ahead and check your registration. If you need any help with registering to vote or requesting your absentee ballot, please let myself or Miss Morgan know. We would be happy to help. All right, everybody, good luck with your homework assignments, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.